Thank you, Dory, and welcome everyone to International Civic and Citizenship Education Studies data for secondary analysis. I'm so pleased Ralph Carstens and Falk Brese will be joining us from Hamburg, Germany, and I'm really glad to have them with us today. We've worked together for several months now to bring the data together at CivicLEADS archive and to be able to share it with the world. It's a really exciting partnership and one that I really value in my role. I am the data project manager for CivicLEADS at ICPSR, and after Ralph and Falk have talked for a little while, I'll tell you a little bit more about CivicLEADS and ICPSR and how to access the ICCS data from us. But without further ado, I'd like to pass the microphone over to Ralph and begin our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, David, so much for the kind introduction. And just let me echo that this is a great opportunity for us also to work with you. But Link, obviously, is somebody who's on our scientific advisory committee, who's also on your scientific advisory committee for the archive. Judith Tornay-Porta, which I like to describe often as the grande dame of civic education, and she was behind much of the early development since the 1970s of this. So we see it as a great opportunity to increase the visibility and the reach of this. I only have a few slides to introduce you broadly into what ICCS is, and then lead you to more detailed information on the web, and then my colleague Falk will take over and describe a little bit more what's in the database and what could potentially be done with it. The broad aims of ICCS, the fourth study on the topic since 1971, are to investigate ways in which young people are prepared to assume their roles as citizens. So this was done in Civic 1999. I need to add a digit there, apologies, in ICCS 2009 and ICCS 2016. To monitor trends, address persisting new challenges. For example, 2016 was done on the back of the Arab Spring, where the global financial crisis, the rise of social media for civic engagement. And we want to continue to reflect changes in context, local and global, and I have a slide at the end on where we would like to take ICCS 2022. This gives you an idea of the participation in ICCS 2009. All of those countries are in our database released through the IEA, but also now in the CivicLEADS archive. You can see it's a lot of entities from Europe, Russia, a little bit in Asia, and also Latin America. 38 participants, in between something that we might broadly describe as austerity or shrinking educational budgets, shrinking research budgets has happened. So ICCS 2016 had 24 participants, of which 23 are nations. One is a subnational entity, the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, colored in blue in this map. And we hope to be back at the level of 2009 in the 2022 assessment. And already a lot of the European countries are coming back that were in the initial CIVET. And some discussions are happening actually this week about possible participation of the United States in ICCS 2022. Just broadly for this audience, probably the needs for the interest in the data can be quite varied. I just want to highlight that this is the same for the countries that participate in the study. And that might already give you some ideas about where to take analysis. So Slovenia was transitioning from a socialist system, but many students lacked a basic understanding. Sweden, in a European Commission report recently, the question was asked whether they are knowledgeable but tame. And in Flanders, they were following up and still continue to follow up on the lowest level of tolerance among the European countries as reported by students. And our General Assembly representative said, never waste a good crisis in these large-scale assessments. It is something to talk about. This gives you an idea about the instruments and the assessment samples. This is for 2016. But 2009 obviously was very similar. We follow broadly the same design. The numbers change upwards, but generally, you know, we have an international cognitive test, a student questionnaire, a teacher questionnaire that is given to all the teachers in the school, not just those strictly limited to civic or social study topics. A school questionnaire, a regional student questionnaire for Europe and Latin America. There was an Asian additional module also in ICCS 2009. And there is information and data at the level of national contexts and systems. Our main findings, just to give you an idea, are considerable differences in the context or how it's organized in the curriculum. We think it has a place in the curriculum, the data shows, but it varies. For example, Latin America, a number of countries are not explicitly addressing the topic of voting. Or also, in our data, we cannot make out a gold standard and saying you do it in a separate subject or in a dedicated, in a curriculum. We can't see a clear relationship with outcomes or opinions or attitudes. And in fact, some countries have hybrid models where by jurisdiction, they have dedicated subjects and sometimes separate. We see increased levels of civic knowledge. Falk will have slides on this, so I'm not going into detail now. It's quite interesting. But again, we see more variation within most of the countries than across all of them taken together. So there's really ample room for further improvement, maybe not so much in countries in Scandinavia, but why not? But more in other areas where civic knowledge and attitudes are lacking according to those that interpret the data. We see more support for equal opportunities by young people than in 2009. This is just one of the many constructs and issues and themes tackled in the data. For example, the trust in institutions, there's a counterpart in the European question about institutions also there. And then we see more knowledgeable students, less trusting in those countries. For example, where institutions are generally perceived less efficient or transparent. One of the very clear findings, time and again in these studies, is that we have a link between civic learning at school. Open classroom climate seems to be a driving factor, civic student engagement and outcome variables, emphasizing a bit the argument that the quality in which civic education is taking place in school seems to be more influential than the formal or distal ways in which it is organized. And there is still support for the long-standing argument that more democratic school environments promote citizenship dispositions, and we can clearly show from the data the relationships and the correlations between knowledge, attitudes, and engagement, and also the anticipation or interest to participate actively as adults. 2016 has been finalized. The set of reports for 2009 were quite similar. The reports are all published openly, either through the IEA or through Springer. There's a framework, an international and European reports, which came out in November last year, pretty much a year ago. A public use data and user guide, which is probably for the audience today the most interesting part. A Latin American report, which we released in Lima earlier this year, and a technical report that took a bit longer, but is now available if you want to read up on the details of the implementation. We are currently preparing a volume on influence, discourse of impact with about 20 country representatives and 10 international scholars on ICCS 2009 and 2016. And there are many contributions I saw for CIES 2019 in April in San Francisco, and the IEA's research conference in June of 2019 in Copenhagen, Denmark. And these are all the reports we produced for 2016. Not in that sequence, but if we align them like this, they make for a nice rainbow. Looking ahead at ICCS 2022, here are 5 broad topics that we feel need to have a bit of an influence and a bit of a reflection in the future of ICCS. One is around global citizenship education and education for sustainable development. Not new concepts, for example, GCED, but they are mentioned and referenced in quite direct ways in the Sustainable Development Goal 4.7. And ICCS is actually the earmarked indicator for 4.74, the proportion of students that have adequate knowledge of these topics in all United Nations member countries. Digital citizenship, about the increasing importance of internet and social media for information and engagement. In 2016, we see that students mostly use it to collect and retrieve information, less so for engagement, say for a political cause, but that could change. Migration and diversity, recent increases. I'm refusing to call it a crisis, in particular in the European region, and more recently, as you will see from the news, in Latin America. Populism and alienation from democracy. There is a long-standing view that there is a democratic recession happening, and success of populist movements. If you would like to read up on this, Yasha Monk is publishing in Politico, Slate, The Guardian, or the New York Times on the topic. And then personal freedom and national security, where the discussion is pretty much an either or, rather than both could be sort of, balanced in reasonable way. And what we would like to do in 2022 is to find out how national educational systems are adjusting to these influences, how they reflected in the local curricula, and how we recognize it if it happens in schools, and how can we ask questions about it. So thank you very much for your attention for this very brief introduction. You will find more information on our microsite iccs.iea.nl. And then for any questions, please send them to iccs@theiahamburg.de. Thank you.
Okay. We were hearing some slight feedback for a moment.
Okay. Okay, so now I think we solved the feedback issue.
Yes.
Thanks, Ralph, for handing over. Thanks for introducing David. So my name is Falk Brese, also working for the IEA, and I would like to tell you a little bit about the international database and its potential use. So, brief overview, I will talk about file types, the data structure and documentation, just the technical part of it, and then come to what you might be most interested in, example results, areas that are still there to explore, and then some caveats you need to know when you analyze the data, but also some solutions to that caveats, and there are some software options out there in the world already. Some words regarding the database. What you will get if you access the database is data files that are country specific. And you get a lot of documentation to it. The most important part would be the IDB, which is International Database Abbreviation User Guide, code books, program files, and technical report. I'll come to that in a minute with more details. First of all, regarding file types. As you see, there are a couple of different file types, and these contain data from the different instruments we use to gather data. So, for example, if you've come across file names starting with ISG, you know that's data from the International Student Questionnaire. Then we have a file from data with student civic knowledge test files, from student reliability files, that's about the scoring of the open-ended items. We had some quality measure to assure that the scoring takes place reliable. We had a regional student questionnaire too, actually, one for the countries from Europe. There, students were asked to, in addition to the international civic knowledge tests and the international student questionnaire, provide some answers to questions relating to Europe and also the European Union. And we had an additional regional questionnaire for the Latin American countries. major focus on that was actually on violence. So we had regional editions with different foci. Furthermore, we asked teachers of 8th grade students in that school to provide some information about civic and citizenship education and their personal background. And we also asked school principals to provide data on the school context. Finally, we asked national research coordinators to fill in what we call the National Context Questionnaire with information about policies and also the context at the national level. So as an example, you might find the file isg-chlc3.sab. So first of all, the file extension tells you the file type. So in this case, it would be an SPSS data file. And as you will hear from David later on, there will be more formats available. Then the first 3 letters of that file name, ISG in this case, will tell you the source of the data. In this case, it will be International Student Questionnaire data. The 4th to 6th letter in the file name will tell you what country the data is from. And in this case, CHL stands for Chilean data. And finally, C3 at the end of the file name is an indicator of the 3rd cycle of ICCS, or a civic education study we implemented at IEA. So that will tell you that this data is from ICCS 2016. The records that are included in the different files, so we included obviously all school questionnaires that were returned by school principals, the same for teacher questionnaires, but there was an additional criteria. We only included the data when the school met the minimum within school teacher participation rate of 50%. For the students, there's also a criteria regarding minimum participation. And we included data in the student files if, first of all, in a sample class, at least 50% of the students returned the questionnaire, and if all sample classes that have been sampled participated. And a class, in addition, was regarded as participating if at least 50% of its students participate. A further note, participating from the student level was counted for if either the student answered the civic knowledge test or the questionnaire data. So only returning the European or Latin American questionnaire was not sufficient for counting as participation. Some words to the data structure. So you will find different kinds of variables. One source is the survey itself, of course. We start with ID variables that indicate different students in different classes, another ID variable, and then different schools. So for all of these levels, you will find a variable indicating the different entities. And finally, you will get a variable, an ID variable for each country, separating the data from different countries. Then you have tracking variables, which tells you, for example, what part of the civic knowledge test students took, and other participation information. Then we have, of course, the variables from the questionnaire and the variables from the civic knowledge test. Later on, while we were processing the data, we added a couple of variables where we simply calculated indices out of variables or added other derived variables. We also added the reliability scoring agreement indicator and some metadata. Also important, what you need to add in order to come up with estimations for the student population we added some estimation and design weights. And also, we added variables that you would need to calculate and estimate the variance. I will come to that again in a minute. And finally, from the scaling stage, variables were added about the scales that we came up in the questionnaire, and we also added the civic knowledge scores. The documentation you will be provided with is, first of all, code books. These are excerpt files with separate texts for each file type, and you get a description out of these regarding variable names, labels, and the valid response codes and options in the questionnaire. There's also some program files available in SPSS and SAS that you might need to score the open-ended items. So for some questions in the student test, in the civic knowledge test, students were asked to answer text, and this has been coded into, for example, correct or not correct. And in order to get these coding from the original variables, you would need those scoring syntax. And finally, and maybe most important, all of what I'm talking about currently, you will find in much more detail in the so-called user guide for the international database. This includes an introduction in the database, as I said, much more in detail about data file structure and contents. An introduction also to the use of weighting and variance estimation variables. An introduction to a software piece IEA developed to easily analyze IEA data, which is called the IEA IDB Analyzer. And also important, some appendices where you, for example, in Appendix A, get a view on the international versions of all questionnaires that were used in ICCS 2016 in this case. By the way, the same is available for ICCS 2009. In Appendix B, you will find the national adaptations of international questionnaires. For example, for the question about the education levels parents receive throughout their life, this will be coded according to an international classification scheme, and that has been adapted to the country's context, and you will find the original question at every country asked in there. Finally, or Appendix C provides you with information about additional variables that we derived during data processing from the survey data. So these are information about indices and scales. And finally, there's an Appendix D talking about items that have been removed from the original database because of data protection issues. More to that you will find also in the user guide. So that was so far about the technical details. Now some example results. Let's talk a little bit about the results ICCS 2016 came up with. So there we found that predictors of student civic knowledge in all countries, all 21 countries that participated, were at the first place socioeconomic home background. So the home background of students predicts student civic knowledge. Again, in all countries, there was a relation between open classroom climate for discussion, and especially for discussing political and social issues, with student civic knowledge. Also there, in every country, these two variables were associated. And finally, in almost all countries, 19 out of 21, female students tend to have higher levels of civic knowledge and civic engagement. What else did we find? So students who expect to probably or definitely vote in local elections, these amount across all countries to 86%. The same percentage probably, or stated they will probably or definitely vote in national elections. And comparing that to voter turnout nowadays in elections, that is quite promising, I would say. And finally, also 81% of the students said they will probably or definitely get information about candidates before going to vote in an election. The final slide with some graphical representation of the results is this one. It's about students' perception of the threats for the world's future. For example, regarding pollution, 76% of the students said they regard that as a threat for the world's future. And as you see, in Colombia, it's 90% and Lithuania, 86%. So there's some variation already across countries. Further, students will also ask if they see water shortages as a threat, and 65% on average across all ICCS 2016 countries said so. And also food shortage and climate change were seen by the majority of students as a threat to the world's future. So this is a very small selection of what you can find out with ICCS data already. And since we have 2 cycles of ICCS, so the first one surveyed in 2009, second one in 2016, we can also look at changes between the 2 points in time. And this table is about the civic knowledge and the difference between the civic knowledge that was administered in 2016 and the one in 2009. And you can see here, most of the countries indicated by the black bars to the right, most of the countries' civic knowledge increased in that time period. The white bars indicate that the change in whatever direction is not significant on a 95% confidence level. So you could also, for those variables that have remained the same throughout the 2 assessments, and there are a lot of them, look at changes over time. What areas are there to explore? I would like to draw your attention to one of the publications of a related researcher, so Ryan Knowles, and as you see, also Judith Tony-Potter, Ralph mentioned her already, and Carolyn Barber, those were involved, and they checked on the research that was done on ICCS 2009 data and also Civic 1999 data. And they came up with 4 themes for civic educators that are frequently addressed and then are of interest for educators. First one is open classroom climate. So in all the research they looked in all the papers, there was a positive association with higher levels of civic knowledge with open classroom climate, and also with the expected political behavior, and also supportive attitudes regarding gender, ethnic, and immigrant rights. So open classroom climate seems to be an important factor regarding those behaviors, knowledge, and attitudes. Also, they found that conceptual teaching helps students acquire concepts and skills more effectively than rote methods of instruction. The third theme that they found researchers are addressing, and they are of importance regarding outcome of civic education, is also student identity. Gender, I believe he sketched that, that overall, across all countries, in most countries at least participating in ICCS 2016, female students were a little bit more knowledgeable regarding civic knowledge than their male peers. Another big topic is race and ethnicity, and also immigration status. And finally, a couple of researchers, and that's more recently, came up with profiles of citizenship norms and attitudes. So they found out, for example, groups of students, one of them they called social justice supporters, mainly in favor of equal rights and also equal rights for ethnic groups, tolerance towards minorities. Then conventional citizens, indifferent, a group of indifferent students, or even disaffected, or even alienated. So also this kind of research shows that there's a lot of potential and also new ways to look at civic education and its outcomes. To have a little bit an overview of what's all in this ICCS data. So there is a framework which includes, first of all, the Civic and Citizenship framework, talking about civic knowledge, attitudes, and engagement, and also the contextual framework, which puts everything into context. For example, within the wider community, the school and the classroom, home and peer context, and student characteristics. This is taken from the ICCS framework. So the aspects I just mentioned are also put into perspective regarding antecedents and processes. And the outcomes will be then the cognitive and effective behavioral learning outcomes. And all of these areas you see here, they have been implemented in the survey, so you can have data on that. Data that's available, for example, on the student level, you don't need to read through all of them. Just to highlight, it's about citizenship self-efficacy as an example, endorsement of equal rights, expected electoral participation or participation at school, and a lot of others. So all these scales actually that are represented here on this slide are available in the data. We have also data from school principals regarding, for example, parents' participation at school or social potential in the local community, and finally data available from 8th grade teachers about, for example, the perception of classroom climate, personal development activities, and whatnot. So these last slides should only show you that there's a lot of data to be still explored. So now some information about how to analyze the data. Coming back to that table with changes over time in civic knowledge since 2009, let's look at the first row, which represents data from Sweden. So you see here the average scale score for ICS 2016 was 579, and in 2009 was 537. So a difference of 42 scale points. So as it is said here, a significant increase from 2009. What do we need to know in order to come to this conclusion? First of all, you need to take into account the study design, and that's a little bit special, and that's a specialty of all these international large-scale assessments. There's a specific measurement design and a specific sampling design you need to take care of. A little bit more to it in a minute. You need to know that ICCS was designed to report on population level. So we want to have some information about 8th grade students within a country or education system, but not on student level. So this is not a student assessment. So we will have estimates for the population, in this case of 8th graders. And as they are estimations, these all come with an error. And where does it come from? So first of all, from the measurement design. For the civic knowledge test, we wanted to include as many items as possible to have a broad range of aspects of civic education and also levels of difficulties represented. How that was implemented is that not every student get every item, but the booklets the students get included only a set of items. And you see here the distribution. So each C stands for a cluster, and there were 8 clusters that were distributed among different places in each booklet. So for example, booklet 1, students answered cluster 1, 2, and 4. In booklet 2, it was clusters 2, 3, and 5, and so on and so on. So that each cluster appeared at every possible location in the booklet, but not every student needed to answer every booklet. Still, we could come up with an overall civic knowledge scale for all of the students using IRT technology. Furthermore, in order to account for that uncertainty, because not every student answered all items, we used plausible value techniques. This is elaborated much more in the documentation, especially in the technical report of ICCS. And we used 5 plausible values. That means that whatever analysis you do, you need to do that 5 times with each of the plausible values and then average the results. But don't worry, I come to the nice solution for that in a minute. And again, this is not a test for students, but we are interested in the population on country level. We also need to take into account the sampling design. We used what is called a probabilistic stratified multi-stage sample. Not so important as you are analyzing the data that is, because you know what that is, but you need to know what to take care of. So we first sampled schools and then sampled classes or teachers. So for example, we have a couple of schools, blue ones representing the stratification like private schools, and the yellow or orange ones are public schools. And then we sampled a couple of these schools, and out of the schools where there, in this example, are 4 classes, we sampled 1, and out of the 8th grade teachers, we sampled at least 15. And we did the same for all remaining schools. That leads us to, if we want to do, if we want to estimate population statistics, we first of all need to use weights and then use a certain technique called jackknife replication. Basically, that means that you need to run all of your analysis 150 times in the case of ICCS and then average the results. If you do all that, you see here, you can come up with the difference and with its standard error. And if you estimated all of it, then you can say, okay, there was a significant change of civic knowledge over time. Sounds maybe a little bit complicated, but there's first of all good documentation provided in the technical report and also the user guide. And furthermore, there's software available that helps you with all that. I already mentioned the IDB analyzer, which is a piece of software where you simply can enter the variables you want to have in your analysis. And the IDB analyzer more or less takes care of all the rest. All this replication I talked about, and also the value technique. And there's other software that does all that. One is from colleagues from the Australian Council of Educational Research. They have also a replicates module you can use with SPSS. There are several ARC packages, and there's M+. So there's a couple of software that helps you with all that. So don't be worried. You're gonna do you can do it, and it's actually, if you are if you get familiar, which is quite easy with all of the software packages, it's easy to analyze the data. But you need to take care of the caveats. Well, that's so far from my side, and I think I now hand over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Falk. I hope that everyone so far is seeing why ICCS data are such a wonderful data set to use, and especially for researchers who are interested in comparing civic education and across countries, across cultures, across time. It's such a wonderful, rich study with such great data, and that's why we're ecstatic to have these data available at CivicLEADS at ICPSR. And hopefully now you'll be seeing my screen, and I will show you a little bit more of what CivicLEADS is all about. As I said before, my name is David Bleckley, and I'm the project manager for CivicLEADS. Okay, so first I'd like to talk a little bit about ICPSR. ICPSR is the Inter-university Consortium for Political and Social Research. We were established over 55 years ago, and we are part of the Institute for Social Research here at the University of Michigan. We are a consortium of over 780 academic institutions around the world, and we are hopeful that many of you are members of our consortium because we make an archive of over 250,000 data files from over 10,000 studies available to our members. However, civic learning engagement and action data sharing, CivicLEADS, is a special project within ICPSR which is available to the general public. So it is not available only to our member organizations and their stakeholders, but also to the general public and anyone doing research around the world. And we're very proud to be able to make those data available to whoever is interested. We are a centralized repository for all of the multidisciplinary research that happens around civic education and youth civic engagement. We know that data come from all variety of disciplines, from education scholars, from political scientists, from sociologists, and many more. And we wanted to make sure that we could find a centralized way to share that, because as people look at those data sets with their disciplinary lenses and look at data sets that were collected from one discipline and examine them in different ways, there's really a lot of opportunities for secondary analysis. And so our main objective is to disseminate great data sets for researchers to look at with that secondary and analytical lens. We're also trying to create a learning community. That's why we provide webinars, and we have a mailing list, and try to do a lot of outreach around civic education and engagement research. This is our 5th and final year of our current grant from the Spencer Foundation. We are so grateful that the Spencer Foundation had the foresight to create this kind of an archive, because they sponsor so much research in this area, and they want to make sure that there's additional research that can be done through these great data sets, and we're very proud to be the archive to share those data sets with the research community. We have a comprehensive website which was launched in 2016, so just a couple of years ago, and currently we have 15 studies which we have curated and released through CivicLEADS, including the two ICCS data sets we've been talking about today. Plus we also have some additional data sets which have been archived by other ICPSR projects. So to jump right in, if you were to go to civicleads.org, this is about what you would see. And as you can see, the main focus is data. We wanted that to be front and center with a large search bar. And so it's a keyword search driven search. And so you could put in any kind of keywords that interest you. It could be political development, or civic education, or volunteering, or any number of civic related topics, and you'll pull up some results. Also across our menu bar, you can learn a little bit more about our work, and you could search by variables or by publications, as well as sharing your own data through our deposit system. And we also have a news list where our blog posts are posted on a regular basis. Looking at the search results page, what I've shown here is just a blank search. So if you just were to push the search button without having any keywords, you'd get the full collection from CivicLEADS. So you can see we have 35 studies. 15 of those, as I mentioned before, were curated by our archive. And you can filter by a number of filter facets along the left side of the screen. And you can see our studies there in the main body of the search results. And the 2 ICCS studies are our most recent releases, and that's why they're at the top. You'll also see that there are other tabs for your search results, including publications, variables, and series. And I'd like to show you a little bit more about those. So if a variable search looks like this, in this case, I searched just for the word civics, and we have over 5,000 variables in our database that have the word civics in them somewhere in the question text or in the variable name, variable label, or elsewhere in the variable level metadata. And this tool allows you to click any of those checkboxes, which are there on the left, and then compare them so that you could see variables across different studies or different variables within the same study. How are they different? What kinds of questions are they asking? And what types of frequencies are the results of those questions? The publications search tool is another search function that we have, and all of our data sets, all of our studies have linked publications to them, so that you can go back and forth. You can find a publication that interests you and then find out which data were used to do the research for that publication. And you can also go from a study and find out what are all of the publications that are there that used that data set. So it's a really great way to start to explore and think about the possibility for future research from any of our studies. I wanted also to show you a study homepage. So in this case, I'm showing you the ICCS 2009 study homepage. And on this, you can see we have study level metadata. If this were an active website instead of just a screenshot, you could scroll down quite a ways down. We have a lot of methodological metadata, as well as just high level overview of what you can expect to find in this data set. We also have tabs here that show the data and documentation, which you can download. The variables, again, this is study-specific variable search, as well as the study-specific publications for this study. And then on the right, you can see that 556 people have already downloaded this, and there are 20 related publications. So if I were to click on the data and documentation tab, I would get this. And because there are so many countries involved and there are so many different types of questionnaires used, the data set list is quite long. If you're on the live website, it will take you some time, and I apologize for that, but I think you'll be happy with the result, because there are hundreds of data sets here, and each one of those is associated with rich documentation about the data. We make the data available in a number of formats. You can download the data in R, SAS, Stata, SPSS. You can download them as an Excel file, or also as a flat ASCII text file, and then import it into any type of analytic software that you're interested in. When you do go to download data, you'll be prompted to log in to ICPSR. And if you don't have an ICPSR account, it's completely free. You just need to enter your email and create a password and add a few pieces of information about yourself and what institution you work for, or what kind of work you do. You can link them to your Google+, LinkedIn, Facebook, or ORCID ID, or you can just create a standalone account. So I'd really like to get into some questions. We only have a few minutes left here, but we'll try to make the most of it. If you have any questions for me, please, again, check out civicleads.org, or you can reach us at civicleads@umich.edu. But please go to the control panel and start entering your questions. We'd like to open this up and get as many questions as possible in the next 6 minutes or so. So if you have questions for Falk about the data themselves, or if you have questions for me about CivicLEADS or how to access the data, please feel free to enter those into the questions box, and we'll give it a couple of minutes because sometimes there's a little bit of a delay in the system. So again, I'm just really thrilled that Falk and Ralph were able to join us. These data are so important. I think that these are going to really provide a lot of areas for researchers to learn more about civic education and civic engagement around the world. And we're just so excited to have the data as part of CivicLEADS archive. Okay, I'm not having any questions yet. Ah, great. Here's a question now. Can someone talk more about the United States being involved in this in the future? As it was mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. I can give a little bit of background, and then I'll pass it over to Falk, who may know some more. I know, so the United States was involved in the 1999 CivEd data study, and those data are also available either from IEA's website or from CivicLEADS. We have those archived with us as well. But the United States did not choose to be involved with the 2009 or 2016 data. And so, Falk, I don't know if you have any information about the next version, the 2022, or do you have any insights into that?
Currently, I don't know what's happening there. I mean, of course, we're talking about that, but yeah, it's still a little bit ahead of schedule. So no, I don't have any indication yet.
Okay, great. And I know that there are a lot of researchers who have been really advocating for U.S. involvement because this is such an important international study, and you know, it is really a shame for us to not be involved. Okay, we have another question. I'd like to understand more about India's participation. Do you know anything about India's involvement, Falk?
No, sorry. Again, no, I don't think that currently we have a positive indication at least. So yeah, as
okay.
India at IEA studies is not so much represented as we might want for, but no, currently,
okay.
I don't have any information on that.
Okay, we're getting several studies asking about specific countries' participation, or even regions' participation, including like Africa or non-Spanish speaking Caribbean countries. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about how what kind of outreach is done to seek out involvement and participation? What does that look like? How does a country get invited, or how do they become involved?
Yeah, so the general route to participate in an IEA study. So first of all, IEA is a membership organization. So once a year we have what we call General Assembly, and there we decide upon implementing a study. And there also member countries know about that, and then can sign up or negotiate or talk about participation. We further have in our Amsterdam office mainly, they are concerned, colleagues there are concerned with contacting countries and asking for interest in participating in those studies. And we're also around in the world on conferences and other policy events to talk about maybe new studies coming up and then trying to get some interest. Yeah, but finally, it's of course up to the countries to participate. And the example we just had, India, for example, not yet a member of IEA. Also, we know that in the African subcontinent or continent, we're not as often represented as in other parts of the world. We're trying to address that also with other studies. For example, for the TIMS and the PEARL study about mathematics, science, and also reading experts, we try to address the country's needs there, but it's always up to negotiation.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think, if there's a specific country or a specific region in which anybody is interested, or which anyone is interested in sort of encouraging them to be a part of it, I think maybe being in touch with that country's Department of Education or other equivalent, and maybe encouraging them to seek out IEA membership, that might be a good first step. There are a few other questions, but I'm aware that we are at the end of our time limit. So please, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email personally. My name is David Bleckley, and you can reach me at CivicLEADS@umich.edu. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you again to Falk and Ralph for joining us from Hamburg today. We're really grateful for your partnership, and we wish you all a good evening or a good day. Thank you.